All right, so are we expecting everyone to be on time? So I guess we'll start going live at 1:30. So hi everybody. My name is Tom Abrams, and I will be kind of just facilitating this Zoom call. We're very privileged and excited to have a special guest today, Anthony Ray Hinton. He's bringing us his story from a couple thousand miles away, I guess, from Alabama. So Anthony Ray Hinton, he survived for 30 years on Alabama's death row. His story is a decades-long journey to exoneration and freedom. In 1985, Mr. Hinton was convicted of the unsolved murders of two fast food restaurant managers based on the testimony of ballistics experts for the state who claimed that the crime bullets came from a dusty revolver found in Mr. Hinton's mother's closet. An all-white jury convicted Mr. Hinton, and he was sentenced to death. After years of petitioning to have the revolver reanalyzed, 3 independent experts concluded that the bullets could not have been fired from his mother's revolver. With the assistance of the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, led by attorney Brian Stevenson, Mr. Hinton was freed in 2015. Since his release, Mr. Hinton has traveled the world, sharing his story and discussing the changes that need to be made to prevent similar injustices from happening to other people. In 2018, Mr. Hinton published The Sun Does Shine, How I Found Life in Freedom on Death Row, which was selected for Oprah's book club and is a New York Times bestseller. In 2019, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from St. Bonaventure University. I have only known Mr. Hinton now for about 25 minutes. It is a pleasure to have him here. He seems like a just down-to-earth, great guy, and it's my pleasure to introduce you, Mr. Hinton. So I will shut my mouth. The kids will probably tell you it's probably hard, but I will shut my mouth. I will go on mute, and I will allow you the time to tell us your story.
Thank you so much for having me. This is a story that I hate I have to tell, but I often say that is something that I think those of us who live in America need to know, that the system is not what they would have you to believe it is. I never will forget, on one of the hottest days in July, I woke up that morning like any other morning, thinking about what I was going to do for the rest of the day. Going to prison, going to jail was the farthest thing from my mind. As I was sitting outside, my mother had made some lemonade, and I went inside to get a glass. And as I was pouring a glass of lemonade, my mother asked me, was I going to revival that night? And I said, yes, ma'am. For in the South, we say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am, and yes, sir, and no, sir, out of respect for our elders. And so as I poured that glass of lemonade, I went on back outside and sit up under this tree for about 15 or 20 minutes. I got up, carried the glass back into the kitchen. My mother was still in the kitchen, and she asked me, what time does revival start? And I said, 7 o'clock, Mama. And she said, well, you got time to go out there and cut that grass. I looked at my mother. I didn't want to cut grass. It was too hot to cut grass, for one thing, and I really didn't feel like cutting the grass. And I looked up at my mother, and I gave her that baby look, being the baby of the family. And I said, Mama, I promise you I will cut that grass tomorrow. And my mother looked at me and she said, I'm trying my best to see how did you get. You will cut the grass tomorrow out of me telling you to go cut the grass. I finally looked up at her, and she looked back at me and she said, boy, get out there and cut that grass. I goes outside and I fire up the old lawnmower and begin to cut the grass. About 25 minutes into cutting the grass, I just happened to look up, and there stood 2 white gentlemen that I'd never seen before. I cut the lawnmower off and I said, can I help you? One of them replied, we're looking for Anthony Ray Hinton. I said, that would be me. Again, how can I help you? They identified themselves as 2 detectives from the Birmingham Police Department. They said, we have a warrant for your arrest. And I said, on what charges? One of the detectives said, we will explain that to you later, but right now, we want you to put your hands behind your back. I complied. I put my hands behind my back and they put the handcuff on me, proceeded to put me in the police car. And I said, hold up, at least allow me the opportunity to go inside and tell my mother I'm being arrested for something. One of the detectives said, we can't let you go back inside. And we argued for about 2 minutes. And finally, the other detective said, let him go in and tell his mother he's being arrested. I goes in and I show my mother the handcuff, and like any good mother, she begins to scream and holler, what are those handcuffs doing on my baby? One of the detectives said, take him out while I stay in here and talk to his mother. A few minutes later, he comes back out and we proceeded to go to the Birmingham County Jail. And on our way there, one of the detectives asked me, Anthony, do you own a firearm? And I said, no. I said, but my mother has an old Smith & Wesson that she keeps around the house for snakes. Once I told them that my mother had an old gun, they dropped me off at a substation, turned around and went back and told my mother that I had told them about a gun. My mother gave them the gun. Once they got the gun, they came back and picked me back up at the substation, and we proceeded to go to the county jail once again. And on our way there, I must have asked these detectives at least 50 times, why am I being arrested? They never would tell me. And on the 51st time, this seemed to set the detective off that wasn't driving. He said, you want to know why you've been arrested? I said, yes. He said, we're going to charge you with first-degree robbery, first-degree kidnapping, first-degree attempted murder. I said, oh, you got the wrong person. I haven't done any of that. He looked at me and he said, let me tell you something right now. I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it, but make sure you remember, I am going to be the one to make sure you found guilty. I said, for a crime I didn't commit. He said, you must have a hearing problem. Didn't I just tell you I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it? He said, if you don't remember nothing else, remember, I am the one who's going to make sure that you found guilty. And as they drove a little farther, he turned back around. He said, by the way, there's 5 things that are going to convict you. Would you like to know what they are? And I said, yes. He said, number 1, you're black. Number 2, a white man is going to say you shot him. Whether you shot him or not, believe me, I do not care. He said, number 3, you're going to have a white prosecutor. Number 4, you're going to have a white judge. And number 5, you're going to have an all-white jury. He said, do you know what that spells? And he repeated the word conviction, 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 conviction. By that time, we have arrived at the county jail. They placed me in a holding cell. I had been in this holding cell for about 2 hours, and finally this detective opened the door and I said, detective, if you don't mind, can you tell me the date and the time this crime took place? He goes through his note, he tells me the date and the time, and when he told me the date and time, I said, thank you, Jesus. And then I said, thank you, God. I said, thank you, God, because I knew on that particular day and that particular time, I had an alibi. I was at work. And I said, thank you, Jesus, because my supervisor was white. And I figured once he go out there and talk to my white supervisor, he would come back and say, Mr. Hinton, we made a mistake. Well, I told him my supervisor's name. I told him his phone number. I gave him the address where I was working. He shut the cell door. He left. About 5 hours later, he came back. He opened his cell. He said, I have good news and bad news. He said, the good news is we no longer going to charge you with first-degree robbery, first-degree kidnap, first-degree attempted murder. Your alibi checks out. He said, in fact, I saw you on one of the forklifts at the exact time that we thought you had committed a crime. He said, but now we have decided that we're going to charge you with 2 counts of first-degree capital murder. I said, capital murder? I haven't killed anyone. He said, do you not recall on the way here, I told you I didn't care whether you did it or didn't do it? He said, the same thing is for these new charges. I don't care whether you did it or didn't do it. but I'm going to be the one to make sure you found guilty. And as I was standing there trying to convince this detective that I could never take another human being's life, he finally put his hands up and he stopped me. And he said, "Let me be honest with you." He said, "I truly believe you didn't do it. But y'all," referring to all black, "y'all are always doing something. And the moment you get caught, you say you didn't do it." He said, "Take this rap from one of your homeboys who truly committed the crime." And I looked at that detective and I said, "Detective, there's not a homeboy in this world that I would take a rap for like this." He shut the door and I sit in jail for about 1.5 years. And finally I went before a judge. The judge read off the charges, asked me, did I understand what I was being charged with? And I said, "Yes, Your Honor." He asked me, could I afford an attorney? I told him, no, I couldn't. He looked back in his courtroom and he called his attorney up front. He tells this attorney he wants him to represent me on 2 counts of first-degree capital murder. The first thing that lawyer said out of his mouth was, "I did not go to law school to do pro bono work." I looked at the lawyer and I said, "Sir, would it make a difference to you if I told you that I was innocent?" That lawyer looked at me and he said, "The problem with that statement is all of y'all is always doing something. And the moment you get caught, you say you didn't do it." I looked at that lawyer and I said, "Sir, I could never take another human being's life." And that lawyer said, "That's what all y'all say." Well, I sit in jail and finally I go to trial. They find me guilty on 2 counts of first-degree capital murder. The judge proudly stand up and say, "Anthony Ray Hinton, you have been found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree capital murder. It is the order of this court that I sentence you to death." And that judge had the audacity to say, "May God have mercy on your soul." The prosecution that day said perhaps a little louder than he intended to say, but the prosecution could be heard saying, "Today we didn't get the right nigger today, but at least we got a nigger off the street." On December the 17th, 1986, I finally went before the judge and he sentenced me to death. I was transported to Holman Correction Facility where I would be placed in a 5x7 cell in solitary confinement. I had no idea at the time that I would be there for 30 long years. But I do know for the first 3 years, I did not say a word to another human being for 3 years. Not even my mother, not even my best friend. Whenever they would come to visit, I would just say, mm-hmm. And my mother always would ask me, "Are you feeling okay?" And I would just say, mm-hmm. I was angry. I was disappointed that I had been found guilty for a crime that I know and God knows that I hadn't committed. But I was angry more with God than I was anyone. You see, at the age of 4, my mother made all of her kids go to church. And my mother had a saying that as long as you live in my house, you have to go to church. My mother brought me up to believe in God. She told me that God can do everything but fail. She told me no matter what I do, God is always there. And I kept wondering, where was God when I was being lied on? Where was God when I was being prosecuted for a crime he knew that I didn't commit? And where was God when the judge sentenced me to death? I had decided that God didn't live inside of me anymore. And going into the 4th year, I woke up at 1 o'clock to the sound of a grown man crying. A man that I had lived by for 3 years and never asked him his name, where he was from. But my mother had taught me compassion. My mother told me no matter what one does in life, they still deserve compassion. They still deserve love, and they deserve understanding. So I got out of this bed that was too small for me, and I walked up to the bars and I said, "Sir, do you need me to call and get the correction officer back here?" It took this man a minute to reply, but finally he said, "No, I just got worried my mother passed." I told him how sorry I was to hear that, and I told him if I can do anything for him, please feel free to just holler and let me know. I sit on this bunk bed that was too small for me, and at that moment, I realized that I had something to be thankful for. My mother was still alive. I was alive. And at that moment, I closed my eyes and I said, in order for me to survive this hell that I'm living, I have to somehow take my mind and leave this place. I closed my eyes as tight as I could, and I began to imagine being at the palace. For I've always wanted to see Queen Elizabeth, and I decided at that moment I would go see the Queen. I arrived at the palace and told the guard that I was there to see the Queen. They goes in and they tell the Queen that I'm there. She invite me in. I tell the Queen who I am. We sit down, we talk about Prince Charles, Prince Harry, Prince William, and the tragedy of Prince Di. About 40 minutes into that conversation, the Queen realized that she hadn't offered me anything to drink. And she stands up and she looks at me, and in her British accent, she says, "Mr. Hinton, would you like some tea?" And I told the Queen I would love some tea. And she said, "What would you like in your tea?" And I told her a spot of lemon. She had the butler to go out and bring some lemon, and I squeezed it in my tea. We drank tea and we conversate some more. About 30 minutes later, I stand up and I tell the Queen I must be leaving. The Queen looks at me and she said, "Mr. Hinton, will you come back?" And I told the Queen I would love to come back. Now that I realize in my mind that I can leave death row anytime I want to, I did something next that I said I would never do. I decided that I would get married. But at the age of 12, I said I would never marry. But I decided that I would get married, and now I just didn't marry anybody. I married the beautiful and talented actress, Halle Berry. Halle Berry and I stayed married for 15 long, beautiful years up here. And Halle Berry was the perfect wife, for she said nothing but yes, dear, and okay, dear. Whatever you want to do is okay with me, dear. 15 long, beautiful years. And then going into the 16th year, the warden decided that he would show us a movie. And the movie was called Speed. And for the very first time, I laid eyes on the beautiful and talented actress, Sandra Bullock. I watched this lady drive this bus around and around. And to be honest with you, I was building my nerves up to give Halle some sad news. And finally, when I built my nerves up, I looked at Halle Berry and I said, "I'm going to divorce you and marry Sandra Bullock." True to her word, she said, "Okay, dear." And by that time, the guard called me. He said, "Anthony, I've been trying to call you for 10 minutes. I said, "I'm sorry. I was gone. What is it?" He said, "You have a legal visit." I said, "But I don't have an attorney." He said, "Well, Anthony, somebody's out there pretending to be a lawyer. Get dressed and go see who it is." I get dressed and I go out there, and there's this lawyer from Boston. I asked the lawyer who in Boston know me that they would send him well to Alabama to represent me. And he tells me a man by the name of Brian Stevenson. I asked him, who is Brian Stevenson? He tells me about Brian Stevenson and the work that they do right here in Montgomery, Alabama. This lawyer for the next 3 years would work on my case. He would come back every year and tell me what he had done, what he had found out. And going into the 4th year, he came back and he said, "Anthony, I can get you a life without parole." And I said, life without parole is for guilty people, not innocent people. I said, you want me to stand up and plead guilty to a crime that I didn't commit? I said, I could never do that. I said, you want me to stand up and tell the victim family that I killed their loved one? I could never do that. I said, the state of Alabama know that I did not kill anyone. But if the state of Alabama is hell bent on executing me for a crime they know that I didn't commit, so be it. I said, we all have to die at some point in some time. I'm not ready to die, and I don't want to die for a crime that I didn't commit. I said, but I could never stand up and say I did something when I didn't. I said, I want to share something with you. I was 12 years old. I said, my mother told me that if I was man enough to bend down and pick up a rock, and if I was man enough to throw that rock, then I should be man enough to say I threw that rock. I said, this is one rock I didn't throw, and therefore I could never say I did when I didn't. I looked at the lawyer and I said, I need a lawyer that believes in me. I need a lawyer that is willing to go to jail for me if necessary. The fact that you're trying to get me a life without parole tells me that you don't believe in me. And since you don't believe in me, I have no choice but to fire you. The lawyer said, are you serious? I said, yes. I said, but I want to thank you for what you tried to do and what you wanted to do, but I just could never do that. And as that lawyer was going at the front door, they was taking me back toward the cell. Something in my mind said, you got to be the dumbest person in the world because you just fired the only lawyer that you had. But just as that thought entered my mind, another thought came to me and said, you did the right thing. Always stand up for what you believe in. And as I got back toward the cell, a guard was watching TV and I stopped and I said, what you watching? He told me he was watching his lawyer out of Montgomery, a man by the name of Brian Stevenson. I asked him, can I stand there and listen for a moment? And he said, yes. Brian Stevenson was talking about the death penalty, why we don't need a death penalty in this country. And as I listened to Brian Stevenson, something came over me. I knew this is the man that I needed to try and get to represent me. As I went in that cell, I wrote Brian Stevenson a letter, and I remember saying, dear Mr. Stevenson, I want to thank you for the lawyer that you sent from Boston, but I am sad to say that it didn't work out. I said, Mr. Stevenson, I would like to ask you a question, and that question being, would you consider being my lawyer? But before you say yes or no, all I ask is that you read my transcript. And if you decide and find one thing that points to my guilt, do not worry about becoming my lawyer. Do not send me another lawyer. I am perfectly willing to die for a crime that I know I didn't commit. About 3 months later, Mr. Stevenson responded saying that he would read my transcript. 5 months later, I get a letter that he was coming to see me. The day that he said he was coming to see me, he came. The day that I shook that man's hand, I knew that God had sent me his #1 lawyer. And as we sit down at the table, we talked about our childhood and our upbringing. And finally, we got to talking about the case. And I said, Mr. Stevenson, if no two guns is alike, I already know that the state of Alabama is telling a lie. I said, Mr. Stevenson, that gun that they got from my mother's home have not been fired in over 25 years. And I looked at him and I said, Mr. Stevenson, I need you to do me a favor. And he asked me what was the favor. I said, I need you to hire a ballistic expert. Mr. Stevenson looked at me and he said, well, I was going to do that anyway. And I said, Mr. Stevenson, I'm not explaining myself right. I said, Mr. Stevenson, I need you to hire a white man. And I need this white man to be from the South. I said, Mr. Stevenson, I have lived in the South all of my life, and the South will only recognize one of their own. I said, Mr. Stevenson, it have to be a Southern white man. Mr. Stevenson asked me, why did it have to be a Southern white man? And I said, Mr. Stevenson, you can go out and get the best white female in the country, but her word is no good on the witness stand. Not in the state of Alabama. And I said, Mr. Stevenson, it cannot be a person of color. I said, Mr. Stevenson, they were definitional good on the witness stand. Here I was on death row, and now I got to worry about what race, what gender a person have to be in order to help me prove my innocence. Well, Mr. Stevenson left that day, and he said that he would try and find that particular white man. About 3 months later, I got word to call him, and I called him, and he had found 3 of the world-renowned experts. He told me that these 3 experts was the best of the best. He told me that these 3 experts, 2 of them live in Texas and 1 of them live in Virginia. And he said, Ray, I need to explain something to you. These 3 experts have never testified for the defense. They only testified for the prosecution. I said, Mr. Stevenson, did you remember to ask them, would they just tell the truth? He said they had assured him they would tell exactly what the evidence say. If the evidence was against me, they would say it's against me. If it was for me, they would say it was for me. And I said, Mr. Stevenson, if you can afford it, hire those 3 experts. They came to Alabama on separate occasions. They all did their testing. They did something that I didn't learn until after I was released. Those 3 experts tried to manipulate the gun to make it match, and it still would not match. And when they finally did their testing, they all 3 got together and told Mr. Stevenson that the state of Alabama had made a mistake. I was willing to let him use the word mistake, but I knew that the state of Alabama had not made a mistake. We take this new evidence to the Attorney General, a man by the name of Bill Pryor. Bill Pryor was quoted as saying, although it would only take 1 hour to re-examine the bullets, but it would be a waste of his time and a waste of the taxpayer money. As far as he was concerned, the right man was on death row. And for not doing his job, George W. Bush appointed him to a federal lifetime appointment. We goes before 2 more attorney general. All 2 new attorney general refused to take 1 hour. And while these 3 men would not test the gun again, I sit on death row an extra 16 years. And while I sit there extra 16 years, I got word that my mother had passed. But my mother was all I ever had. All of my life, my mother had always been my biggest cheerleader. And without my mother here, I told Mr. Stevenson that I didn't care about that case. I said, if the state of Alabama wants to execute me right now, they can. I don't care. And I could somehow hear my mother telling me that she didn't bring me up to be a quitter. She brought me up to fight when there was a fight. She brought me up to stand up for what I believe in. The next day I called Mr. Stevenson and told him that I wanted him to give the state of Alabama all the hell that he could give them. We filed our case. We went before 14 judges in Alabama. They all refused to do the right thing. And finally, Mr. Stevenson said he was going to file my case to the United States Supreme Court. 2 years after filing to the United States Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court did something that it have never done in the history of the courts. All 9 justices ruled in my favor that I was entitled to a new trial. They sent the case back to Alabama. We goes before a judge. The prosecution stand up and say, Your Honor, it is with great sadness that I inform this court that we have lost the gun to this case. The judge said, what do you mean you lost the gun? They said, Your Honor, we cannot find it. She gave them some more time to find the gun. She set a court date for us to be back in her courtroom. That day come, we go back. The prosecution stand up and say, Your Honor, it is with great pleasure that I inform this court that we found the gun to the case. But once again, it was great sadness that I inform you today that we cannot find the bullets to the case. She gave them more time to look for the bullets, and while we thought they was looking for the bullets, we found out that the prosecution had called one of his experts and asked him to come and test the bullets one more time. He came and he tested the bullets. He quoted in the Birmingham newspaper as saying that the bullets do not match the way they did 30 years ago. The bullets, they didn't match 30 years ago. It wasn't going to match 30 years later. I spent 30 years in solitary confinement. For 30 years, the state of Alabama knew that the bullets never did match. But we have a system that if you don't have the money to hire a decent defense, more than likely, if you found in charge with a crime, more than likely you will be sent to prison. How is it that we have a system that treats you better if you're rich and guilty, opposed to if you're poor and innocent? How is it that the state of Alabama had every intention of executing me in the name of justice in each and every one of your names? The state of Alabama was going to execute me in your name, in the name of justice. And today, I would like to ask you, where's my justice? Where do I get justice from? What would be justice? Here I am. This coming Friday will be 6 years of being free. No one have had the decency to say, Mr. Hinton, we're sorry. But I want you to know that I forgave the men that got together, lied and tried and got a conviction. I forgave them. They haven't asked me for forgiveness. But I am a believer that if you don't forgive, you will never be free. I want to be free. Every day, I have to live with the fact that they took 30 years of my life. 30 years that they could never give back. I didn't get the opportunity to say goodbye to my mother. They took everything that they could take from me, but I refused to let the state of Alabama have my joy. You see, the world didn't give it to me, and the world can't take it away. I would like to ask you, what would you do if they came for you? What would you do if you were charged with a crime that you didn't commit? What would you do if you didn't have the money to hire decent defense? What would you do if you passed a polygraph test, but they cared more about the color of your skin than the results of that test? What would you do if you was found guilty and sentenced to death? What would you do if you had to spend the rest of your life in a cell smaller than your bathroom? What would you do if you've been waiting all your life to die? And finally, one day, you were set free. Who would you be? Because I have to ask myself that every day. Every day, I try my best to be a voice for those that don't have a voice. Every day, I try to fight for those who cannot fight for themselves. Every day in this country, men and women goes to death row that are innocent. Today, I ask you to join me and let's put an end to the death penalty in this country. Thank you for listening to my story.
Mr. Hinton, I would like to say thank you for sharing your story. I'd also like to say that, I know I'm sorry. And though I might not be a proxy, I think that we're all kind of seeking your forgiveness, for the time that you spent, on death row. It's just, it's a tragedy. And thank you again for sharing with us. So, I mean, I'm just completely blown away and flabbergasted and all kinds of thoughts running through my head. As an English teacher, I value stories, and the real stories like that are just so impactful. We heard about your perseverance, setback after setback, the love for your mother, and how she stood by you. Those are the stories that are just so meaningful to us. And then obviously our struggle with race in America and justice. And that's why we, again, we thank you for being here. The kids will tell you that I'm long-winded. I like to talk, but I'd like to give them an opportunity to ask you some questions, because this is the generation that's going to kind of work and hopefully help solve these problems and grapple